Tensions between the United States and China notching up higher. Beijing authorities have hit back after President Joe Biden took aim at China in his State of the Union address.
We made clear, and I made clear in my personal conversations, which have been many, with President Xi, that we seek competition, not conflict. I'm committed to work with China where we can advance American interests and benefit the world, but make no mistake about it. As we made clear last week, if China threatens our sovereignty, we will act to protect our country, and we did.
There's been more friction between the superpowers following the discovery of a Chinese high-altitude balloon over America. The US Navy has been recovering remnants of the airship in the sea after the military shot it down over the weekend. American intelligence officials insist that the Chinese were using it to spy and claim that it was used to collect information on strategically relevant territories, including Japan, India, Taiwan and the Philippines. Chinese authorities have denied that, saying that it was a weather balloon used for scientific research. Our correspondents in China and the US are standing by. Let's get first to CNA's Lo Minmin. She's in Shanghai. Minmin, tensions already boiling over between the United States and China, and Mr. Biden's untypically direct comments in his State of the Union address, they just added more fuel to the fire.
That's right, Dawn. I mean, one of the standout moments in President Biden's speech when it comes to China was when he went off script, asking the audience to name one world leader who's willing to swap places with President Xi. And you can just hear the passion in his speech as he repeated that statement. It was said in context of his praise for democracies and the fall of autocracies. And after he finished his spiel about China, you could hear the audience standing up and chanting, USA, USA. And even though President Biden did not mention China directly until towards the end of his speech, if you listen between the lines, China was really that recurring theme that occurred throughout his entire speech, even when he was talking about domestic policy. He first started talking about the need to ensure a supply chain begins in the U.S. to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. That was clearly in reference to this tech race with China to ensure that sensitive technologies are manufactured on U.S. soil. And then when he talked about inflation caused by a pandemic that disrupted global supply chain, there was a veiled swipe at China, which until the end of last year stuck to its zero COVID policy. And when he talked about the U.S. opioid crisis, we know that U.S. politicians have been pointing fingers at China for supplying the chemicals that are being used in illicit drugs that are getting into the United States. And then when he talked about the need to stop big tech from collecting data on teenagers, this is coming at a time when Chinese social media app TikTok is facing a hearing next month in the United States to defend its data collection policy. Clearly, China, a threat that is being used to unite both Democrats and Republicans.
Minmin, before this, diplomatic relations between the United States and China, it seemed at least to be on a better footing before the discovery of that Chinese balloon, thought to be a surveillance balloon by the United States. China's accused the United States of overreaction, overshooting it down, but tell us more about Beijing's take on the matter.
Well, China says that it does not shy away from competition, but it is opposed to using competition to define the whole Sino-US relations. It's also opposed to the US smearing China in the name of competition and limiting what it calls China's legitimate development rights. Clearly, comments targeted at U.S. efforts to impose a semiconductor blockade on China and U.S. efforts to impose export restrictions on sensitive 5G technologies on Chinese firms. And Chinese state media appears unconvinced of Biden's message that the U.S. is seeking competition, not conflict. One commentary reads that China will not be, quote, hoodwinked by the wordplay of the Biden administration, which is, in fact, for domestic consumption rather than reflecting any real changes in its approach towards China. And when it comes to the balloon, the Foreign Ministry repeated what it said earlier, that it's irresponsible and unacceptable for the U.S. to use force to attack an unmanned civilian airship. Dawn?
All right, Min Min, thank you for that. CNA's Lo Min Min reporting live from Shanghai. Let's bring in Jagruti Dave now. She's in Washington, D.C. Jagruti, Mr. Biden made a defiant, almost dramatic speech calling out China. What's been the reaction to his address?
Yeah, he spoke very loudly, very firmly, clearly an attempt to show to Republicans who had been criticizing him vociferously in the lead up to the State of the Union address that he was not weak on China. Those were some of the criticisms that had been leveled against him and his response to the downing of that suspected spy balloon. Now, as Lo Min Min had suggested, that this speech was peppered with references to China directly and indirectly, from the balloon to supply chains. But some Republicans have come out saying that wasn't enough. He should have spoken more about China. Former Defense Secretary Mark Esper saying that there should have been more on China. Kevin McCarthy, the new Republican House Speaker, tweeting that, his priorities clearly lie elsewhere. He's not speaking enough about China. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has said that relations between US and China shouldn't be a zero-sum game. But some observers suggest that, President Biden was really trying to achieve some form of unity there, uniting those Republicans and Democrats who believe that the United States needs to take a tougher, harder line approach to China.
And on that, Jagruti, a Republican US lawmaker, we understand, is planning to lead a bipartisan delegation to Taiwan in the coming days. I mean, what can we read into this? Is this in any way in retaliation to the discovery of that balloon, that Chinese balloon?
Look, I think the balloon incident clearly has is yet another addition to the already complicated dynamic between the US and China. This is the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCall, who's indicated that he is planning to lead a delegation, a bipartisan delegation to Taiwan. He's not the first Republican or even the first US lawmaker to do so or to suggest so. Kevin McCarthy, the Republican House Speaker, had said even before the balloon incident that he would consider leading a delegation to Taiwan at some point later this year. Of course, that very controversial trip by the former House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy's predecessor, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan led to China's ramping up of military exercises and a new flaw to the US-China dynamic, which was already in quite a precarious position even before that controversial trip. So I think with China having warned Kevin McCarthy not to make the same mistakes as Nancy Pelosi with this trip, this is not going to go down particularly well in Beijing. News of yet another potential US delegation. And I think this balloon incident, as I say, has just added fuel to the fire, really, of that simmering, difficult relationship that has been existing between the US and China for some time now.
Jagruti, thank you. Jagruti Dave there in Washington, D.C.